All right, let's dive right in. Today we're taking a trip back in time to a period between 1750 and 1900 that completely rewrote the rule book for how the world does business. This was a time of huge, revolutionary change, and it's the period that literally built the global economy we live in today.
To really get a feel for how massive this transformation was, think about something super simple: sugar. Back in the mid-1700s, sugar was a big deal. If you had it in your kitchen, you were almost certainly rich. For most people, it was an expensive, hard-to-get luxury.
Now, fast forward just 150 years. By 1900, that whole picture had flipped. Suddenly, sugar was everywhere. It was cheap, it was in just about everyone's pantry, and it was a daily staple. So how on earth did that happen? Well, that little change in your teacup is a window into a massive revolution in how we think about money and trade.
To understand the revolution, you first have to understand what came before it, and that system was called mercantilism. This was a world where governments didn't just regulate the economy, they had an iron grip on it.
So what's the big idea here? Well, under mercantilism, a country's power was all about how much shiny stuff it had. Seriously, wealth was measured by the amount of gold and silver a nation had piled up in its vaults. The whole point was to build a giant national treasure chest.
And how did they do it? The state was the master planner. The basic game plan was to sell more stuff than you bought. To make that happen, governments would slap huge taxes or tariffs on anything coming in from another country. And colonies? They were absolutely essential. They were treated like giant farms, forced to supply cheap raw materials and then buy back the expensive finished goods. It was a completely top-down, tightly controlled system.
But then, a totally radical idea started to bubble up, thanks in large part to a Scottish philosopher named Adam Smith. What he proposed wasn't just a small tweak, it was a bombshell that would challenge the very foundations of mercantilism. It was a genuine revolution in thought.
And you can see just how different it was right here. Smith flipped the whole thing on its head. He argued the goal shouldn't be about the king's treasure, but about the prosperity of everyday people. He said the government should just get out of the way, a philosophy called laissez-faire, which literally means let it be. The real engine for growth, he said, wasn't some grand state plan, but the ambitions of individuals all chasing their own self-interest.
Smith's most famous concept to explain this is the invisible hand. So how does it work? It's actually pretty simple. Think of a baker. She's not baking bread because she's a saint, she's doing it to make money to support her family. That's her self-interest. But to get your business, she has to compete by making good bread at a fair price. And in the process of trying to help herself, she unintentionally ends up benefiting the whole town. That's the invisible hand at work, guiding private ambition to create a public good.
Of course, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. This new way of thinking didn't just take over without a fight, and not everyone was convinced that a totally free market was the answer. You see, while it was amazing at creating wealth, it also created some pretty serious new social problems, which led to some really important criticisms.
And these critics basically came from two different angles. On one side, you had thinkers like Jeremy Bentham. He looked at the poverty and inequality and said, look, the market isn't going to fix this on its own. He argued that the government does have a role to play, to step in and make decisions that create the greatest good for the greatest number. Then you had guys like Friedrich Wist, who argued that pure free trade was basically a rigged game. It was great for a powerhouse like Britain, but for smaller developing countries, it was a recipe for disaster. He said they needed to protect their infant industries with tariffs, at least for a while, to even have a fighting chance.
So, as these new ideas about freer trade started to win out, the world began to open up in a big way. And this new global stage was the perfect breeding ground for a brand new, powerful kind of business to emerge: the transnational corporation. These things were operating on a scale nobody had ever seen before.
So what exactly are we talking about here? This isn't just a company that sells its products in other countries. Oh no. This is a company with its headquarters in, say, London, but it owns factories in West Africa, it runs offices all across Asia, and it's pulling resources out of the ground in South America. They were truly global, setting up shop wherever they could find new markets, cheap labor, and raw materials.
A perfect example of this is HSBC. It was founded in Hong Kong, which was controlled by Britain at the time, and its whole reason for being was to bankroll British trade all across Asia. Its growth was directly tied to financing the machinery of empire, everything from building railroads to get resources out to funding the deeply controversial opium trade. It showed just how tangled corporate power and state power could become.
And then there's a name you probably recognize: Unilever.
As cities grew, so did the demand for products like soap. To get the ingredients it needed, especially palm oil, Unilever built a massive global supply chain that stretched deep into colonial territories in West Africa and the Belgian Congo. This created a system where these colonies became economically dependent on shipping out a single raw material, often under horrific labor conditions, all to keep European bathrooms stocked with soap.
So you might be wondering, where did all the money come from to build these global businesses? Well, two financial innovations were absolutely key. First, you have stock markets, which let companies raise insane amounts of cash by selling tiny little pieces of themselves to the public. And second, the invention of the Limited Liability Corporation, or LLC. This was a total game changer. It meant that if you invested in a company and it went bankrupt, you only lost the money you put in. They couldn't come after your house or your savings. This lowered the risk dramatically and unleashed a flood of new investment.
Okay, so let's pull all these threads together. This epic shift from state control to market economies, powered by these new global corporations, left behind a really complex legacy. On one hand, you have incredible, unprecedented growth, but on the other, you have some serious, often hidden costs.
For a lot of people in the industrializing world, the upside was huge. We're talking about explosive economic growth. For the first time, a real middle class started to form, people who had extra money to spend. Factories were churning out goods that were suddenly affordable for ordinary people. Farms were producing more food than ever. And all of this led to something amazing. For the first time in human history, average lifespans started to go up significantly.
And really, that's the main takeaway. When you look around at our world today, with global companies, 24/7 stock markets, and supply chains that wrap around the planet, you're looking at a system whose fundamental DNA was written during this exact period. The roots of our modern world are right here.
But that leaves us with one final, really important question to think about. We've talked about the growth and the rising standard of living, but what's the other side of that story? What was life actually like for the people working 14-hour days in those factories? And what was the true human cost of getting all those raw materials out of the colonies? Because the story of this era is also a story of how progress for some came at a tremendous cost for others. And that's a legacy we're still grappling with today.